Welcome, everyone. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sujata Swaroop is a clinical psychologist with an expertise in the treatment of trauma. She is currently the program coordinator of Project REACH, a program that conducts evaluation and brief intervention with victims of human trafficking. Dr. Swaroop is also a postdoctoral fellow and clinician at the Trauma Center at JRI. She holds a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology with a concentration in international psychology and human rights. In addition to work with a U.S. population of veterans, young adults, and children and adolescents exposed to trauma, she has also provided long-term individual psychotherapy to asylum-seeking survivors of torture. Her training has focused on evaluation and treatment of common psychiatric disorders, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Swaroop has also received specialized training in diversity and cross-cultural issues. She represented the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies as a delegate to the United Nations 54th Convention on the Status of Women in 2010, and served as a student delegate to the 2012 NATO Summit. She has presented and published on topics such as trauma, recovery, community reintegration in the wake of war, genocide, internal displacement, and gender-based violence, honoring differences in trauma and loss across cultures, the impact of poverty and social class on childhood development, the effects of intergenerational transmission of trauma in nations with a history of colonization, and transnational and culturally specific models of trauma healing in African and Asian contexts. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us today, and I will now hand the presentation over to you, Dr. Swaroop.
Thank you, Regina. So my name is Dr. Sujata Swaroop, and I'm going to be talking about the intersections of polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking. Next slide. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge our funders. As part of the OVC 2012 National Action Partnership on Polyvictimization, we are engaged in a project on enhancing multidisciplinary responses to polyvictimization. Project REACH, my organization, is also funded through the OVC. This webinar is co-sponsored by OVC, the Complex Trauma Work Group, and the Complex Trauma Treatment Network of the NCTSN. The content I am presenting today is based on my own findings and the findings of my organization, which may not represent the official position or policies of these funding sources. Next slide. Finally, I also want to recognize the network affiliate sites and staff who have contributed to these series, which are listed on this slide. Next slide. So on to the objectives of this training. This presentation is developed for interdisciplinary service providers who work with survivors of human trafficking. So this training is tailored to mental health service providers, child protective services, probation officers or law enforcement, legal providers, medical providers, educators, and community advocates, among others. During this presentation, I'm going to define polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking, and discuss the relationship between them. I will also discuss the psychological sequelae of polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking, with the understanding that exposure to this type of trauma may create a variety of unique symptom pictures or clinical presentations. And finally, I will also introduce a new model for trauma-informed practice that can be applied across broad systems of care. So as a result of these objectives, at the conclusion of this training, participants should feel more prepared to recognize and effectively respond to survivors of human trafficking. Next slide. Defining our terms. What is polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking? Next slide. As you may know, there are many ways to define polyvictimization, which is also called multiple victimizations or multi-victimization. The simplest way to define polyvictimization, and the way I'll use it today in this presentation, is as exposure to two or more types of victimization. It's important to note, however, that researchers define this term differently, and that therefore there is no single definition that can be applied across the research. For instance, polyvictimization can be looked at as a continuous or categorical variable, such as Finkelhor's use in 2007, where he investigated trauma symptoms in children with a minimum of 4 or more types of victimizations in 1 year. Whereas other retrospective studies of adverse childhood experiences, such as ACEs, have defined polyvictims as having exposure to at least 3 of 10 adverse childhood experiences. No matter how polyvictimization is defined, it is important to understand the magnitude of this problem. It is generally agreed that in the U.S., 10 to 25% of the general population experiences polyvictimization, and this number is higher in clinical samples. For instance, in a nationally representative sample of 2,000 children, 22% were detected as victims of 4 or more types of victimization within the past year. Next slide. It is important to note that types of victimization are limited to interpersonal traumas. So, for example, natural disaster would not count as a category, whereas experiences of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect would. This slide lists examples of various types of victimization. Again, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using the term polyvictim to refer to someone who has experienced 2 or more types of victimization. Next slide. Complex trauma refers to the exposure to trauma as well as the dysregulation that results. In this presentation, we refer to complex trauma as the reactions to traumatic exposure, and we refer to polyvictimization as the exposure itself. So the complex trauma construct refers to the range and the depth of effects of polyvictimization in children and adults. Next slide. So what are complex trauma reactions and what do they look like? Complex trauma reactions are very different from the symptom triad of intrusions, hyperarousal, and avoidance that we see in PTSD. These are reactions that you would expect in someone who's experienced a single acute trauma. In the case of multiple traumas, or a single trauma experienced in a chronic way, for example, parental neglect over the course of development, we see a mixture of PTSD symptoms and complex trauma reactions. So complex trauma reactions can include changes in one's relationship with others, such as decreased trust, increased withdrawal, or a tendency for re-victimization. It can include somatic complaints, such as chronic pain and headaches, emotional dysregulation, such as hypervigilance or always feeling on guard, or experiences of depression, anger, and anxiety. It can look like dysregulations in consciousness, such as numbing or feeling detached from one's body, or dissociation. It can be seen in the use of behaviors to regulate one's emotions, so cutting, substance abuse, running away. It can also be seen in alterations in systems of meaning, such as seeing life as hopeless or the world as unsafe, and in alterations in one's sense of self. For instance, we often see a pervasive sense of self-blame, shame, guilt, or helplessness in survivors of complex trauma. We also see individuals who regard themselves as quote-unquote bad or quote-unquote worthless. Next slide. And finally, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a buzzword that has been very present in media lately, but is commonly misunderstood. According to the legal definition used within the United States, there are 2 distinct types of trafficking. Elements of human trafficking can occur in the commercial sex industry, as well as in situations of forced labor or services. Sex trafficking involves obtaining a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person forced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. Labor trafficking involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services, again through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So essentially, human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery, which involves making money off an individual by forcing or coercing them into some type of labor or commercial sex act. It should be noted that with minor sex trafficking, force or coercion is not necessary, and in both adult or minor cases of human trafficking, coercion can be both subtle or overt. Next slide. Sex trafficking can involve one or more forms of commercial sexual exploitation. This can include, but is not limited to, prostitution, pornography, erotic massage, or exotic dancing. This type of trafficking takes place through a variety of venues or mediums. Sex trafficking may include residential brothels, hotels, homes, truck stops, the street, massage parlors, strip clubs, cantinas, via escort services, or even online. Next slide. Within the United States, victims of labor trafficking often work as nannies or maids, in sweatshops or factories, at construction sites, in janitorial or housekeeping work, in nursing homes, in daycare centers, in restaurants, in salons, or begging on the streets. Labor trafficking can include exploitation via domestic servitude and childcare, sweatshops and factories, motel and hotel housekeeping, and agricultural work. Next slide. As I said, human trafficking has been a buzzword lately as we've become more aware of its prevalence and magnitude. But there are many misconceptions of it, and so let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. A few of the most common misconceptions include that victims of human trafficking must be foreign nationals or immigrants, and that travel, transportation, or movement across borders is inherently involved in trafficking. In actuality, the federal definition of human trafficking includes both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. Both are equally protected under federal trafficking statutes and have been since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Human trafficking encompasses both transnational trafficking that crosses borders and domestic or internal trafficking that occurs within a country. Further, the legal definition of trafficking, as defined under federal statutes, does not require transportation, which is often misunderstood, although transportation may be involved in the crime, and although the word connotes movement. Human trafficking is not synonymous with migration or smuggling. Instead, it's more accurately characterized as compelled service, where an individual's will is overborne through force, fraud, or coercion. Next slide. While public service announcements and various media often depict victims of trafficking as physically restrained, it is crucial to be aware that victims often are restrained via psychological means of control, such as threats, drug addiction, or traumatic bonding. These more subtle means of control will be elaborated on later in the webinar. Related to this, it is commonly believed that trafficking only takes place in illegal underground industries. However, trafficking can occur in legal and legitimate business settings as well as underground markets. Trafficking occurs in restaurants, bars, salons, home, and online. Of equal importance, interdisciplinary service providers must be aware that victims of trafficking do not immediately seek help or self-identify as victims of a crime. This can be due to lack of trust, self-blame, or training by the traffickers. Therefore, it is important to avoid making a snap judgment based on first interviews, and to understand that trust will take time to develop. Continued trust building and patient interviewing is often the key to getting the whole story. Next slide. So exact statistics and numbers are very difficult to generate or track because trafficking is an underground activity. Social scientists estimate that 27 million people are in human trafficking situations worldwide at any given time. According to the United States Department of State's Trafficking Persons Report in 2013, it was estimated that between 600,000 and 800,000 victims were trafficked across international borders worldwide. Nearly 40,000 victims were identified last year. Of those 40,000, roughly a fifth were victims within the Western Hemisphere. So while a wide range of estimates exist, and we really can't be sure that any of them are anywhere near correct, the magnitude of human trafficking is undeniable. Next slide. In fact, after drug dealing, human trafficking is tied with illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal industry in the world and as the fastest growing. The human trafficking industry generates up to $10 billion per year in the sale of people, with a total market value estimated at $32 billion, including the profits from activities and goods produced by the victims. This is quoted by the United Nations, and again, it should be cautioned that statistics may be nowhere near accurate due to the underground nature of trafficking. Next slide. So we've talked about what these terms are, and it's very important to understand how they're related. You might guess that the relationship is linear, with one leading to another. Polyvictimization leading to complex trauma reactions, leading to trafficking experiences. but in fact it's a much more complex relationship, and it's multidirectional. Next slide. So this slide is meant to depict how experiencing chronic trauma and various types of trauma may leave an individual more vulnerable to being trafficked, and how traumatic exposures during trafficking, such as force, fraud, and coercion tactics, may exacerbate complex trauma reactions and place an individual at further risk for revictimization. Basically, polyvictimization or multiple trauma experiences make it more likely that complex trauma outcomes will manifest. We've already talked about these manifestations, such as emotional dysregulation, alterations in consciousness, alterations in systems of meaning, and so on. Such complex trauma outcomes increase an individual's vulnerability to being targeted and recruited for trafficking. And I want to give an example of this because I think this is really important. And so I use a de-identified example of a woman named Natalie. Natalie was born male and identified as a transgendered youth in Mexico. She was told that she was trashed by her father, by her uncle, and by her siblings, and she was repeatedly raped by her community members and other family members and peers because of her sexual orientation. Because of how she was treated in her childhood, she believed that she was worthless and quote-unquote undeserving. She was able to run away, and in her escape, she met a woman who took her in and cooked meals for her, which was the most important thing to Natalie at this time. In time, this woman began trafficking her in order to help Natalie cover her rent, which is what Natalie was told. Natalie believed that she owed this and that she could not deserve more. Later, one of the Johns that she was trafficked to acted as her boyfriend and told her that he loved her and that she deserved better than this life. He helped her escape, and then he began trafficking her in the U.S. and was very physically abusive. From Natalie's example, we can see how exposure to traumas related to human trafficking may exacerbate complex trauma responses, such as your impacting sense of self and sense of self in relationships, and that this in turn further increases the risk for revictimization or increased polyvictimization experiences. Next slide. So to understand this relationship more, let's look at conceptual models of pathways to polyvictimization in children. This first pathway, pathway 1, can really encapsulate Natalie's experience. She was born into a dangerous family and experienced childhood maltreatment, including sibling assault and sibling maltreatment. She then experienced peer victimization as well in her community, which led to polyvictimization. There are 3 additional pathways, according to this researcher, which is cited by Finkelhor. Finkelhor stated that each of these appear to contribute independently to the onset of polyvictimization. We actually see a combination of these paths in human trafficking survivors. And from my case example of Natalie, you can see how polyvictimization makes it much more likely that complex trauma reactions will manifest. Next slide. While my case example of Natalie is anecdotal, current research also suggests that polyvictims are more likely to experience complex trauma reactions. These graphs show symptom levels for 4 kinds of victimization profiles in children across 6 different types of traumas. As you can see from the significant differences in trauma scores across the following groups of no victimization, exposed to less than the average frequency of one type of victimization, those with more than an average frequency of one type of victimization, and polyvictims, the evidence suggests that there is something qualitatively different in being a polyvictim that leads to more distress. So in other words, this research suggests that children exposed to more than one type of trauma, as in the case of Natalie, are more vulnerable to poorer outcomes compared to children who may even had long-lasting exposure to one type of trauma. Next slide. Again, let's think about what these trauma outcomes may be. The ACE study, for example, found that polyvictimization has a lasting legacy in the lives of victims, and exposure to more types of trauma significantly increases poor clinical outcomes. This can be along the lines of substance abuse, suicidality, anxiety, and other mental health problems that interfere with functioning. It's important to remember that the complex trauma construct emphasizes the range and the depth of short and long-term effects of polyvictimization in children and adults, while polyvictimization relates to traumatic experiences or exposure types. Next slide. And how does this relate to trafficking? Here are some things that we know about people who are targeted and recruited into trafficking. They are often vulnerable in some way. So think about Natalie. Her sexual orientation as transgender led to repeated sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect by her family and community. Similarly, those recruited into human trafficking are often vulnerable in some or many ways. In addition to her history, they may have witnessed domestic violence, they may have had a parent with addiction, they may have experienced racism or sexism, they may have come from low physical resources, such as poverty, or low emotional resources, such as poor early attachment systems and not having a lot of people to count on. Domestic sex traffickers often prey on at-risk children. These children who have unstable family lives and who have often been the victims of sexual and physical abuse. Domestic sex traffickers recruit them by making false promises, at times providing drugs, or utilizing other enticements. Once involved with the trafficker, the victim is prevented from leaving through psychological and/or physical coercion. Next slide. In addition to the traumatic experiences that may make someone vulnerable to trafficking, once a person is trafficked, they may face a variety of traumas throughout force, fraud, and coercion. This could include displacement, threats to the self or family, physical or sexual assault, and traumatic bonding, or relationships that are mixed with fear, control, and love. So again, with Natalie, her pre-trafficking childhood was fairly horrific, and then when she escaped by running away, she was targeted for sex trafficking and continued to be re-victimized through abusive relationships, sexual assault, and forced or coerced commercial sex acts. She also experienced restrictions to her mobility and isolation, threats of deportation by her trafficker, and she was denied medical care, though she experienced significant symptoms. Next slide. And of course, when we think about this multidirectional relationship between polyvictimization, complex trauma reactions, and human trafficking, we recognize that trafficking experiences may exacerbate complex trauma reactions, placing an individual at risk for further revictimization. Escaping from a trafficking situation does not necessarily mean escape from all danger. For instance, often survivors remain vulnerable given low resources or access to care. Secondly, relational patterns established in trauma, including how one sees oneself both in terms of self-worth and what they can expect or to deserve in a relationship, can contribute to revictimization. Thirdly, methods of coping to survive trauma, such as substance abuse or self-injury, also increase the likelihood of ongoing or continuing trauma. So think again about Natalie. Due to how she saw herself and the thought of what she could expect in relationships, she was re-trafficked several times by different perpetrators before escaping. Often when we encounter a victim of human trafficking, we only think of trauma exposures experienced during trafficking. Yet this relationship between polyvictimization, complex trauma reactions, and human trafficking reminds us that there is a much broader scope. Next slide. So recognizing the psychological effects. Given the relationship between polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking, what might we see when working with a survivor? And how can we identify a survivor? Next slide. This slide is critically important. Human trafficking is a hidden crime. Even when victims are right in front of us, we often miss the signs. So looking beneath the surface is critically important. Often we see X, Y, and Z symptoms and assume X, Y, and Z diagnoses without looking any further. What we see instead, and think about the language and the assumptions here, is an addict, a prostitute. We hear she must want to live like that. We hear she's in a fight with her boyfriend. We hear she's angry, resistant, difficult, she doesn't want my help. And we hear it's not my business. Next slide. It's important to remember that a victim of trafficking may look like many of the clients or patients or individuals that we see daily. It's very important to think about asking the right questions and looking for clues. So as an example of the wide-ranging clinical presentations that we might see in survivors of trafficking, I'm going to present 2 case examples. The first woman that I'm going to present is Sherry. And as I describe Sherry's history, please think about what your impressions might be from meeting her initially. How do you think you might engage with her within your discipline? And how would you conceptualize treatment or intervention within your discipline? Also, think about what barriers to treatment you might find within your discipline, whether it's failure to return to the medical setting, failure to cooperate with law enforcement, etc. So Sherry is a 30-year-old female. She reports a family history of alcohol dependence. She reports ongoing polysubstance drug use, including marijuana, alcohol, and cocaine. She reported that her first use was 13 years ago and that she's used on and off since that time, and her longest period of sobriety has been a few months. As you meet with her, she describes increased depressed mood, irritability, anxiety, fatigue, and sleep problems when not using these substances. You may notice some mild cognitive impairments, and she describes a history of chronic suicidal ideation. This includes history of suicide attempts by OD as a teenager. She also describes difficulties fulfilling any of her roles at home or at work. So off the bat, providers might assume that she is suffering from substance abuse issues, depression, anxiety, and notice the suicidality. But as we look under the surface and remain curious in her story, and over time develop trust, we may find out more. Next slide. Over time, and through a network of providers, Sherry was identified as a survivor of sex trafficking, polyvictimization, and complex trauma. Of course, this dramatically changes the needs for treatment across disciplines. So let's think about why women who have experienced trafficking, polyvictimization, and complex trauma may be more likely to use substances. Here are some quotes from human trafficking survivors we have worked with. He would hold it over my head. No coke unless I brought home my quota. I was desperate. At first, we were just partying a lot. I was helping him sell, and we were rolling in dough. Then I started to need it. Before I had a date, he'd give me some oxy to help me relax. I drank to stay with my boyfriend, so I wouldn't think about the things he was making me do. Through these quotes, we see instances where substances were used as vulnerability factors, where substance abuse was part of the trafficking itself, and where substance was used as a means of coping. So in addition to typical substance abuse treatment, these factors will need to be explored. For example, if her trafficker is also her supplier, a number of safety supports need to be put in place. I'll get into this further in a little bit. Next slide. Here's the second case scenario of someone we might see in our office across disciplines. And this, again, illustrates how trafficking victims may look like many of the clients we see daily. As I describe May's history, think about your impressions and what they might be as you're initially meeting her. How do you think you might engage with her within your discipline? And what are your thoughts regarding barriers to treatment? May is a 24-year-old female. She presents as extremely difficult to healthcare providers, and this can be seen in terms of being agitated, being angry, quickly becoming anxious and then uncooperative, and presenting as guarded. She has a history of many physical complaints that cannot be explained by medical conditions or the direct effect of a substance, and her complaints include pain, dizziness, abdominal pain, and general pain that impairs her functioning. She also describes depressed mood and ongoing suicidal ideation. She has previous suicide attempt by overdosing. So again, off the bat, as providers, we may presume somatic reactions, malingering, depression, relational problems. But again, as providers looked underneath the surface with May, they found out that she was a victim of labor trafficking. This identification took trust, curiosity, and a lot of time. They were able to find out that she was brought to the U.S. from China with false documents and that she was induced into domestic servitude through force, fraud, and coercion. Next slide. So May was experiencing a number of somatic complaints as her psychological distress had physical manifestations, including the dizziness, the fainting, and the abdominal pain. She was convinced that she was HIV positive, even though she had tested negative on 3 occasions. Many of her providers were perplexed by her presentation, and she had difficulty maintaining relationships with any of her providers. She fired some, she pitted others against others. It created havoc within her network of collaborative care. It was very important for us to consider in May's case that while physiological responses to trauma, such as the fight, flight, freeze, and submit response, are considered culturally invariant, the meaning of the trauma response and the meaning of her symptoms and the approaches to health and healing that she took varied quite differently and will vary from person to person. So as providers, we really need to understand the individual personal framework of the person who's presenting. May's experience of her distress was somatic, and her experience of trauma was a physical reaction. Because of this, she was looking for treatment that will be medical. So as a provider, no matter your discipline, it's important to understand the frame and then pull in the necessary resources. And again, this will vary from person to person. Next slide. So when we think about symptom pictures that might make us wonder about polyvictimization, complex trauma, or human trafficking, these are a list to think about and watch for, although this list is not exclusive or exhaustive. So think about, like Sherry, that we might see behaviors to manage traumatic exposures. This can be seen through substance abuse, running, self-injurious behavior, among others. Next slide. And when we think about relational patterns and dynamics that may indicate the need to be curious about trauma and trafficking, here are a few factors to watch out for, including impaired trust, broken radar or difficulty with boundaries, reenactments and revictimizations, linking of love, sex, and abuse, the need for love and affection linked to neglect, and in general, difficult relationships with professionals. And again, think about how this might sound like May, the impaired trust, the difficult relationships with professionals. Next slide. It's important to understand that the psychological effects of human trafficking are wide-ranging, and that they lead to a number of unique presentations. So when a human trafficking survivor walks into our office, we might see chronic headaches, stomach aches, and somatic symptoms. We might see aggression, anxiety, anger, or different emotional experiences. We might witness behaviors that attempt to modulate this emotional experience, such as cutting or substance abuse. We might witness hoarding or restrictive foods. And we might see reactions considered quote-unquote difficult or resistant. Next slide. The takeaway point from this section is that there is really no single typical face of a victim of human trafficking. Survivors of human trafficking may be foreign nationals or domestic victims. They can be adults or minors. They may be victims of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or both. That being said, traffickers tend to target and prey upon the most vulnerable in society. For example, those in sustained poverty, with a prior trauma history, or unstable socioeconomic or political climate, those with family illness, and those who've witnessed domestic violence. So as a result, across the various types of human trafficking, individuals most vulnerable to trafficking crimes are often undereducated, impoverished, and or previously traumatized. And herein lies the relationship between polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking. Next slide. So in addition to clinical presentations, what are some red flags for survivors? Here are some things that we can look for and what we can see. While a single indicator is not conclusive, a cluster of signs may point to the need for further investigation. For example, if you ask someone what city they're in and they do not know, this might indicate something. One of the main tactics of traffickers is to use frequent movement of their victims so they're not able to get to know the area, make connections, or seek help. Another example of things to look for is no documentation. So if someone in front of you doesn't have a driver's license or a state-issued ID, a passport, or a green card, there are not many of us that walk around without any form of ID. And even folks who are undocumented will carry some form of identification on them. So the next slides contain additional potential indicators or red flags for victims of trafficking. And while further evaluation or assessment is outside the scope of this presentation, you can email me if you have specific questions pertaining to evaluation or assessment. Let's skip ahead to treatment, and you can read through these slides on your own. So given what we know about polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking, how do we respond? How do we provide care within and across broader symptoms? Next slide. As you can see, we understand that core impacts from polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking affect domains of dysregulation, so including emotional responses and dissociation, affect altered self-identity, we can see this in self-blame, guilt, and shame, and in difficulties in interpersonal relationships, so difficulties with engagement and trust in providers, and so on. Given our discussion on the impact of polyvictimization and complex trauma across pre-trafficking vulnerabilities, traumas encountered during trafficking, and post-trafficking experiences, and given our understanding that trafficking survivors endure a wide variety of experiences and present with a variety of unique symptom pictures, this is an intervention model used by Project REACH to treat human trafficking survivors. It's important to understand that this intervention model can be applied to any discipline. It focuses on the process of your interactions, and it addresses thematic or core areas impacted by polyvictimization and complex trauma. So it is our hope that, for instance, lawyers can engage in this way using their content, medical providers can engage in this way, educators, and so on. This treatment model can be seen as a framework to keep in mind when working with survivors, no matter what your discipline. The next several slides will break down this treatment model. Next slide. So let's start with the context. Traumatic events threaten a person's basic sense of safety. They can also weaken a survivor's faith in the ability of authorities to provide protection, and in one's faith in themselves to modulate dysregulation. So it's very important to take time to get a sense of a human trafficking survivor's current context. Is he or she in a safe place? Is he or she in crisis? Does he or she have access to basic needs, like food security, shelter, appropriate clothing? Making linkages to the appropriate social services is key in early stages of intervention. This is not only meeting critical needs, it's also building safety and trust in your relationship as a provider. This is where treatment starts, and this is how it's grounded. So for instance, take Sherry. If through your dialogue with her, you realize that she has relapsed and is back with her trafficker, who is her drug supplier, this understanding sets the entire frame for treatment, whether you're law enforcement, a medical provider, a therapist, or so on. Current physical and psychological safety needs must be addressed before any further treatment is started. Next slide. Now let's look at the second layer of the treatment foundation, which is the empowerment model. This layer of treatment is based in trauma theory, stages of change models, and also utilizes precepts from emotional interviewing. The theme here is facilitating the development or rebuilding of a survivor's sense of control and power, or self-efficacy. So trauma, if you think about it, by its very nature is disempowering. Victims of human trafficking have had their power taken away from them. Often survivors of human trafficking have not had space to explore their priorities or their wishes. So as a provider, no matter your discipline, you want everything you do to reestablish that power for the survivor. So the previous layer can be seen as understanding the context, meeting the client where they're at, and making sure they're safe. The important message in this second layer is that the power is in their hands. You, as the provider, are a support system. The focus is to tap into and build off of the survivor's strengths and resiliencies. Understanding the very fact that they've survived indicates that they have strengths. So whatever your discipline, help the survivor connect with the sense of, I got through this, it's not the end of the road, but I got this far and I have strengths. Next slide. Now the last of the foundations, which is the relational framework of treatment. Human trafficking is very personal in nature. The trauma is interpersonal. Polyvictimization and complex trauma necessitates relational work because of this. So your provider relationship is paramount to any type of intervention. It's important to remember that attachment trauma gets played out in all future relationships. So expect and accept the relational push and pull that might occur. For example, if you think back to May, there was actually constant violence and abuse in her childhood home, and her early experience of relationships included fear and deference to men, and the perception of women as needing to comply with men. This relational dynamic was reinforced by her trafficking experiences. And later in treatment, when interacting with a wide variety of providers, whenever she felt out of control or began to trust and felt dependent and then was struck with fear, she expected to be hurt. And so she'd try to regain control by acting out in passive-aggressive ways with providers. Other times you may see this use of unhealthy coping, such as Sherry, when someone feels out of control. So, for instance, using substances or running away. But May saw her providers as all good or all bad, and she created havoc between her network of providers by pinning one against another. So a huge community of providers were at each other's throats, there was a lot of burnout, and providers often were reacting to her, and therefore she didn't see them as consistent or reliable. The important message is that whatever your discipline, treatment is a different experience of a relationship for a survivor. So it's very important that if a survivor acts out, as providers we're not reactive but consistent with set predictable boundaries and that we're reliable. So I encourage you to think about your role. Think about what kinds of relationships you have with your clients. Think about how consistent and predictable you are in your relationships. Also, it's very important to think about how aware are you of your own reactions while providing care or services, and to know what it is that might trigger you. As providers, of course, we're going to be triggered, and we're going to have reactions when meeting with a client. But being aware of that and noticing ourselves reacting internally or externally and being able to manage that own reaction is very important. Next slide. And now for the core of this model, beginning with relationships. So your relationship as a provider mirrors relationships a survivor will have in the outside world. If you think about your relationship with a survivor as a place for roles to be tried out and practiced and experimented with, then through a positive relationship, you're supporting reconnection with others in a safe and positive way. So no matter your discipline, while some will have more influence than others by their very nature, this is very important to consider. For example, for someone who has survived sex trafficking, it can be very hard not to see oneself as a sexual commodity. So think of Natalie. Her father and her uncle and her siblings all told her that she was worse than trash. She never knew that she could have a relationship with someone without giving something. And then the woman who acted like a mother to her became her pimp. And then the John who helped her escape that situation, acting as her boyfriend, began trafficking her too. So for her, through her relationships with her providers, Natalie actually began to explore questions such as, how do you know when someone respects you? How do you know when and how to trust? How do you build clear boundaries in relationships? And so no matter your discipline, the work here is rebuilding the broken radar system so that a survivor doesn't have their radar silent all the time, increasing the potential to engage in harmful relationships and be re-victimized, or so that their alarm system isn't going off all the time, like a constant alarm, that can really make it difficult to build trust and safe relationships. So through your provider relationship, you're also building a survivor's sense of self in relationships, and this is very critical to remember. Next slide. The second piece to the treatment, the core of this model, concerns regulation. So within this domain, I'm going to talk about three different things: co-regulation, psychoeducation, and skills building, as they pertain to a variety of disciplines. Co-regulation relates to the idea that treatment is relational and that things are coming up in your provider relationship. Again, this may be triggered by issues of control, safety, trust, or power. And co-regulation involves the idea that you can use your body as an instrument to understand what might be going on for the provider. So when sitting with a survivor, if I notice myself feeling wound up or intense or anxious about how a person is feeling, I often realize that I'm feeling this way because they're feeling this way. And it's important to remember to first calm myself down and deal with my own internal reactions, and then use this calm, safer place that I'm at to address the survivor in a way that is grounding, soothing, and calming for them. So this can be likened to the metaphor of when you're in an airplane, you're told to use your oxygen mask before putting the oxygen mask of the person on next to you. And this co-regulation idea is very important with trauma survivors. So for example, if you remember back to Sherry, Sherry had started attending AA, and she had been clean for about 1 month before more trauma memories and more trauma reactions started coming up. She realized that in the past, she had used substances to block these out. So part of what we worked on was that when she was in the room with me and became dysregulated, I would help her notice it, asking simple questions such as, what's going on for you right now? What are you feeling in your body? And then we'd bring her down to contain it. So for instance, through grounding. Next slide. So what does this look like? This slide depicts a window of tolerance, or the optimal range of emotional experience for functioning. If a person feels too activated or too frozen, then they're no longer working in their optimal state, and the brain's actually affected, and the responses are going to be different in relationships. So the idea, and this is very important, is to help a person be aware of their state of regulation, to help them identify and express to you their own emotional experience, whether they're feeling agitated, whether they're feeling frozen, or if they're feeling okay. It's also important to help them identify what caused this regulation and to help them regulate. So again, with Sherry, over time she began to anticipate what her triggers might be. And for her, this was feeling out of control, feeling vulnerable, feeling quote-unquote bad. And she began to notice her physiological and emotional reaction. And as she noticed more, she was able to play the tape out in her decision-making. She was able to slow everything down and notice her internal state before reacting, so that she was acting instead of reacting. In doing this, she built her capacity to divert from what might cause relapse. Next slide. So I've used the term grounding, but how do we ground someone? This slide contains ideas for modulating arousal. Hopefully you'll see that these ideas can be used across disciplines. So something as easy as paying attention to how the survivor is feeling and taking a break when you notice a significant increase or decrease in arousal, like the person getting worked up or shutting down. Distractions or switching topics to something that's less triggering may also be helpful. And so might physical movement, whether it's taking a brief walk or even just a few seconds for stretching or something like 5 minutes for yoga. Taking a few minutes to focus on breathing and using diaphragmatic breathing or breathing from the belly can also be highly effective for modulating arousal states. So these are really simple things that can make a big difference in interactions. Next slide. And finally, the last piece of the core of this intervention model is the self. So with polyvictimization, complex trauma, and human trafficking experiences, often a survivor's sense of self is taken away and it's replaced with negative self-appraisals such as, I'm an object, I'm damaged, I'm a bad person. Another manifestation of this can be numbing or detachment from the sense of self. So sometimes we hear, I can't think about what's happened to me, I just block it out. Across disciplines, it's important to be present with a survivor in a way that supports the shift from victim to survivor to person. So the work is often around building identity, including positive aspects of the self, and questions around competency, roles, and future might be helpful. So let's think about Natalie again. She had no history of experience from learning a good story about herself. The message to her was always, you're not worth anything. And she just knew herself as not good. When we met her, she was fairly young still. But she had never had the opportunity to be a kid, to be creative, to try different things or think about her future. She shared that a breakthrough point for her with one of her providers was when one of her providers asked her the simple question of, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said she could feel that her provider believed that she could be what she wanted to. So again, this treatment core of the self is really grounded in the relational and the empowerment model. Be curious about the person in front of you and what they want for their life. Show interest. It's important to listen and reflect what's important to them, reflect their strengths. It sounds so simple, but it makes such a huge difference. The way you ask questions in your line of work can also be empowering. So something as simple as, and how did you survive that, can make a big difference. If they don't see their resiliency yet, see it for them and name it. Also, something as simple as asking about hobbies can support someone in feeling thoughtful and related instead of reactive and isolated. Eventually, we want the shift that looks something like, yeah, some bad things happen to me, but that doesn't mean that I'm bad. I've had experiences that I won't forget, so I'll be able to make meaning from them. So some survivors have talked about making meaning by helping others, and the others have talked about changing the way that they parent. Next slide. I want to stress that any intervention with a human trafficking survivor should pull from supports across a range of disciplines. So no one profession should be acting in isolation. As a provider, it's important to engage with a network of carefully crafted supports to provide coordinated care for the victim or survivor. Next slide. So any number of collaborations can exist, and this will vary depending on a person's needs. The focus should be the importance of communication and collaboration among service providers, and this cannot be stressed enough. Working together through the lens of an all-encompassing, individualized action plan is very important. Think about coordinating across agencies to address basic needs and safety, shelter and housing, mental health services, legal services, substance abuse treatment, educational planning and support, employment planning, including skills building support, and so on. Next slide. So I hope this information on trafficking and polyvictimization and complex trauma has been informative, and that this intervention approach is seen as useful and utilizable across broader domains of intervention. This concludes my presentation, and I believe we have some time for questions. So Regina, I'm not sure if any questions have come in.
Yeah, we do have questions. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So in your experience in regards to getting multidisciplinary services to trafficking victims, what has worked and what has not worked? So what types of services do you typically refer to?
That's a very good question. So some of the services that we use in Project REACH include psychological evaluations that can provide recommendations to interdisciplinary service providers. They can also assist in obtaining a T visa or a trafficking visa if a victim wishes to stay within the United States. And so when we conduct our evaluations, our recommendations vary from person to person depending on their needs. But often our recommendations include protection from traffickers, having a safe, stable living environment, immigration relief, especially if returning home is seen as dangerous physically as well as psychologically if returning home means there's no supports and the person's likely to be re-victimized. We also recommend specialized mental health services, and this often takes on a phase approach of establishing safety, providing a relationship that can build self-capacity, provide psychoeducation and support, emotional regulation, develop coping techniques that are effective and healthy before going on to work on complex trauma reactions. It's only done once someone's stabilized. We also recommend any type of increase in social supports. Often peer-to-peer mentoring is one of the most effective interventions for survivors and groups. We recommend a complete physical to see the impact in both labor and sex trafficking and to evaluate somatic complaints. Sometimes further assessment around dissociation is necessary, and social services to other support roles. For example, if we see a young mother, having access to material resources is necessary for child care. A parenting group or classes are sometimes helpful. Substance abuse programs are often part of our recommendations if that's relevant. But I want to address the first part of that question. The most important piece to think about this is, I think, twofold. One, coordinate a very collaborative network of care where there's no one profession that's in charge of everything, but there's a network providing care to the survivor. And also the idea of pacing. So keeping in mind stages of change and readiness and what's most needed at that moment. So the moment that a survivor is separated from her trafficker, she may not be or he may not be interested at all in psychotherapy, whereas a shower and clean clothes and a place to stay might be very welcome. So thinking very carefully about what's going on, what the context is, how safe this person is, and making recommendations based on that.
Okay, thank you. So you kind of touched on this. It sounds like most trafficking victims would not seek mental health treatment for themselves. So how do mental health providers build bridges with other providers who are more likely to encounter victims?
That's also a great question, and one that I think I could respond to in a variety of ways. One of the main sources of referrals that we get in Project REACH is through legal services. So often when someone's detected as a survivor of human trafficking and they're engaged in legal processes to obtain their T visa, or if law enforcement is working to prosecute their trafficker, an attorney will be working with the victim throughout the legal proceedings. And often at that stage, the attorney is able to build a relationship with the survivor gradually and through a number of meetings. And once they establish a secure enough relationship that has a sense of safety and a sense of trust, they're able to pull us in to conduct a psychological evaluation that might support that case. Once we meet with a survivor, that relationship is also built very gradually. It might be that an evaluation is conducted over a number of sessions with psychoeducation and skills building infused into the meetings so that survivors are taking away skills and not just reporting on their trauma history. So the idea is that we tap into relationships that survivors have been forming with other providers and use that as a bridge. Medical providers and emergency department staff are also main sources of referrals for us.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. This question is about prevention. So what can providers do if they work with young children to help raise awareness or build resiliency, especially if these children are polyvictims, that would prevent re-traumatization or getting involved in trafficking? Do any prevention programs exist?
Prevention programs do exist, so that would vary region by region or state by state, wherever the person is asking this question. Anyone who's interested in referrals to specific programs can either email me or look into the Freedom Network, which is a national organization, and Polaris, which is also a national organization that compile resources in local areas. It's very important to build local bridges and empowerment between connections locally. Thematically, working with child survivors to prevent re-victimization, I would think about issues such as building trust, building safety, building a sense of power and control, building self-esteem, and relationship capacity. Those factors together would thematically help someone not to re-engage in a victimizing relationship.
Okay. I have a question about treatment. So it sounds like it takes a long time to build trust with a survivor of trafficking, and that relationship develops gradually, and that there's a lot of background trauma history that's very complex. So would you then say that the treatment model does not include trauma processing, and instead it's just helping skill development or positive sense of self rather?
That's an excellent question. And in this treatment model, I don't include trauma processing because this model is intended to be able to be used across disciplines where trauma processing may or may not be as applicable. And within the field of mental health, there's a lot of debate on whether trauma processing needs to occur or at what point. Some say that trauma treatment is very phasic, alternating in a spiral between establishing safety in the relationship and building skills building so that a survivor feels that they're able to modulate their own emotional and experience and their experience of consciousness, so dissociation. And the more capable one feels in terms of modulating their emotional experience and their dissociation, the more ready they would be for trauma processing. And so when that's attended to, trauma processing can take place. And then the third phase would be reconnection. Once this trauma is processed and meaning is being made from the trauma, how does this person connect with themselves, with others, and with the world in a new way that is meaningful in their new identity and their new connections? And I say spiral because it seems to be understood generally that with increased sense of safety and increased skills building, someone's more able to tolerate trauma processing and more able to reconnect this new identity, and that it's very cyclical and deepening and widening.
Okay. Could you tell us more about the work that Project REACH does and the services available through that program?
Absolutely. So Project REACH has been in existence for a little over 10 years. We operate out of the Trauma Center in Boston, but we respond throughout the nation and within U.S. territories. We are grant-funded by the Office of Victims of Crime, and we have been since our origination. And we provide direct services to survivors of human trafficking. Often that's free of charge because it's grant-funded. And so we'll travel to wherever someone's detected that's been trafficked, and we'll either provide crisis intervention or brief skills intervention. Sometimes we provide groups if there are a number of survivors in a given area. We conduct psychological evaluations, and again, the recommendations from those evaluations may pertain to interdisciplinary service provision, or it may be used to obtain a T visa, a trafficking visa. Then, in addition to working directly with survivors, we also work with a wide variety of service providers who work with trafficking survivors themselves. So we put on trainings, we provide outreach, and we provide technical assistance to attorneys, medical providers, law enforcement, anyone really who's working directly with a human trafficking survivor. And our contact information should be on that last slide if anyone has any questions or needs to contact us.
Okay, great. So that resource will be available on the website. Can you talk about trafficking visas and what the requirements are to apply for a trafficking visa?
That question I may have to defer to. I'm not an expert in the legal arena. I know that there are a number of different ways that our evaluations are used. Sometimes to get a trafficking visa, often a survivor has to agree to cooperate with law enforcement in prosecuting their perpetrator, their trafficker. And sometimes a survivor is able to do that and able to get a lot of meaning out of that process with support. And at other times, that's just too triggering for a survivor, and facing their perpetrator in a courtroom setting is just beyond their capacity. And so in those instances, there's something that's called a trauma waiver, and that is another reason that we're called in. We can, through our evaluation, cite ways and show traumatic reactions that it would really be unhealthy for someone to sit in front of their perpetrator and testify. So that's one way that we help in visas. And then our typical evaluations, not the trauma waivers, also support the presence of PTSD or complex trauma reactions, depression, generalized anxiety, and show that for this one, that there's been impact from trafficking. They also show the force, fraud, or coercion that existed during the trafficking to support that trafficking took place. And it demonstrates that often returning back to the country of origin, in the case of foreign nationals, would be rather unsafe, either for physical means of threats to safety, threats to a family's safety, or through the simple means that there's no resources in place there, either for mental health treatment or physical resources, and the person would likely be re-victimized. So that's somewhat of what our evaluations go for.
Okay, switching topics a little bit, can you speak to the use of yoga and mindfulness in adjunctive treatment for survivors of trafficking?
Yeah. So if we think about yoga and mindfulness, if you think about, for instance, sex trafficking and how repeated sexual assault can cause someone to detach from their body or see their body as unsafe or not trustable, we often hear survivors say that they see their body as bad. Yoga and mindfulness can help us reconnect with our bodies. It can help instill a sense of goodness in our bodies and see ourselves as good. Sometimes it's easier to start this process on the body level than starting on the psychological level. So the physiological level also gets activated in yoga and mindfulness, in that it gets us into that window of tolerance that I spoke about in the regulation piece. It helps build a sense of mastery and competence over emotional and physiological experiences that can lead to a sense of power and control. So without that sense of ability and capacity to manage affect states and physiological reactions, it's nearly impossible to begin narrative processing or trauma work. And mindfulness involves deliberately paying attention to what you're doing right now, moment by moment. And it's generally agreed that everything except sleep can be done mindfully. So through mindfulness, we become aware of our thoughts. So for instance, the thought, I am stupid. We become aware of feelings like I am feeling sad. We become aware of our behaviors, such as acts of aggression. And we become aware of our physiology, whether we're breathing fast, whether we're feeling nauseous, what we feel in our stomach. And these observations, moment by moment, they actually allow for a step back. We call this cognitive fusion when we're not able to step back. But the step back allows us to say, I'm having thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. I'm something else. I'm something beyond my thoughts. So if I'm having the thought, I'm stupid, that's just a thought, that I might not really be that way. And practice over time gives us stability of mind. It helps us feel more alert and more clear. It gives us flexibility of mind, or the ability to shift your mind from one thing to another rather than feeling hijacked. It improves self-awareness, and it leads to acting rather than reacting, like I talked about with some of the case examples, becoming less reactive and impulsive and choosing how you'll act and playing the tape out like Sherry. So these approaches are actually really useful. No one approach is going to work for every survivor. Different things will work for different people, but in general, we hear that yoga and mindfulness, and particularly trauma-informed yoga, can be very helpful for survivors.
Thank you. I have another question. So the person is asking if more victims are likely to come forward more recently, because you mentioned that trafficking is getting more public attention and media attention.
That's something that we can hope for. I think the very nature about trafficking makes it very difficult to self-identify. When we speak with survivors, often survivors, in the moment that they're being trafficked, don't understand that they're victims. Often there's a lot of self-blame and self-criticism of, I got myself into this situation, I shouldn't have made X or Y decision, and I got there. And even though with time, they can step back and see that they were victimized and taken advantage of and targeted, but at the time it's very difficult to see that. It's very difficult to self-identify as a victim in the situation. And so I hope with increased media influence, with increased awareness of prevalence and magnitude, that there will be. I think one real major factor here is that as survivors are coming forward and self-identifying, they're also becoming advocates in their own community. A number of survivors travel quite a bit speaking out and advocating on their experiences. And I wonder if victims hearing these survivor advocates, that will actually be the push that really helps self-identification.
Could you speak a little bit about the criminalization of being a victim? So is it difficult for law enforcement to say, this person has been a prostitute or done something illegal, and how do we treat them without punishing them?
So that's a great area for any advocates to get involved in. This is something that varies state by state based on legislature. There's something that's called safe harbor laws, and many states have these, many states are in the process of ratifying these, but until recently, someone who had been sex trafficked repeatedly and again often was charged with prostitution or other crimes, while the perpetrator, the trafficker, and even the Johns were getting off without any type of prosecution. Gradually, as we're becoming more aware of systemic issues, this is changing. And again, those safe harbor laws are getting ratified across more and more states. This is something that really needs to continue, and there's so many different dimensions to this. For example, the stricter that these laws are, they not only protect the victim of human trafficking, but in criminalizing the act of trafficking, some states are making a lot of penalties for those that were involved, whether it was the Johns or the perpetrators, the traffickers. And in these penalties, there's often fines. And large fines mean that there can be a collection of funds to provide services for victims, which is incredibly important. I don't think there's a lot of states that have any type of restitution offered to survivors, and that's on a case-by-case basis. So I think that this is one area that we can continue to really fight for and improve victims' advocacy.
Okay. You mentioned some specific assessments and services that are recommended, but what are the risks if a single provider is providing all of these services and assessments?
I think one of the major risks is actually burnout for that provider. This can be extremely difficult work, and it can be very difficult to know what our triggers are. You could be very aware of some, and others might surprise you. That definitely happens for me. And having some space, having other colleagues to work with, working together on the same goals, and having a bunch of different eyes on what's going on can be very helpful. I would find it very difficult, I think, to try and provide all of these services as one provider and not get too entangled into enactments or too triggered or too burnt out. And I think that's actually common across a number of trauma work. It's not specific only to human trafficking, but definitely pertains to it. I also think that to really provide survivors with the wide range of services that they need, I find it hard to believe that any one professional would be able to access the social services, the legal services, the federal law enforcement, the local law enforcement, and really provide that network and attune to all of the needs in a manner that respects the survivor's capacity to handle referrals all at once or to stage them. I think having a number of collaboration in that is much more important.
That's a very helpful answer. Another question, sort of related, is, so if a provider is working with a victim, what other trainings could be sought out relevant to human trafficking?
There's some consensus in the field that there are similarities between human trafficking and domestic violence. There are certainly similarities between human trafficking and CSEC, or the commercial sexual exploitation of children. They lie on a continuum. It would be, I think, wonderful to gather training across disciplines. So, for instance, I'm in the mental health profession, but the more aware I am of services for victims within legal services and within law enforcement, the more likely I am to provide accurate referrals and to know resources for different survivors that I'm working with. So I think getting trained both more in-depth within your field and broadly across fields would be really important if that's possible. I also think this is somewhat related to training, but paying attention to vicarious trauma and engaging in self-care to keep centered and to keep able to provide the best of care in this work is very important. So adding whatever activities are necessary into your day or your week to be able to do this type of work on a daily basis is quite vital.
I have a question from someone who works in international settings, where providers have less formal clinical training and fewer community supports available. So are there ways to apply this treatment model in these settings? Are there different pieces that you would pull out and say are easier to apply than others?
I think the cultural frame is very important here. So thinking locally about how distress is manifested, what is most distressing in a situation, rather than exporting a Western frame would be very crucial. And thinking about cultural approaches to health and healing rather than just accepting the Western frame as well. In relation to the training, I think there are a lot of free trainings that are available online if internet is accessible. Again, most of these trainings will have a Western frame, so hopefully those would be helpful and applicable. And I can't stress the importance of building local collaborations, learning about whatever resources are available and really galvanizing those so that on a local level there's a collection of resources available. I think that would be probably most important.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I have.
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, my information is on this last slide. If any questions do come up or if I breeze through anything too quickly, please do feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to go over anything. And I hope that this was helpful.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, especially to you, Dr. Swarup, for your presentation. And thanks to the audience for joining us today. Please remember, everyone, to complete the post-presentation evaluation survey. We need your feedback, and that's also key to getting access to the post-test if you're looking for CE credit. And as a reminder, the final presentation in this series will be next Thursday, April 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And Regina Musicaro will present this 2-hour webinar on enhancing multidisciplinary responses to polyvictimization, highlights from the Complex Trauma Speaker Series. So please join us for that. And again, thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.